The coelacanth. For more than a century, scientists and paleontologists firmly believed that the coelacanth was nothing more than a ghost of the prehistoric past. The only evidence that this unusual creature had ever existed came entirely from the fossil record, and because the very youngest of these fossils were dated to be around 66 million years old, biologists naturally concluded that the entire lineage had gone completely extinct alongside the dinosaurs. It was firmly established in scientific literature, serving as a classic textbook example of an extinct prehistoric fish that had long ago vanished from the world's oceans. But the natural world often holds secrets that defy human expectations. On December 22, 1938, a fishing trawler commanded by Captain Hendrik Goosen returned to the harbor in East London, South Africa, after a routine trip. Among the massive pile of the day's catch was an incredibly unusual, heavily scaled, pale blue fish. It was enormous, measuring about 1.5 meters or 5 feet long and weighing in at around 57 kilograms or 127 pounds. A local museum curator named Marjorie Courtney Latimer happened to be inspecting the catch and noticed it immediately. She had never seen anything quite like it in her life. Realizing its potential importance, she went through great lengths to preserve the specimen. Because clear photographs were far too difficult to obtain quickly in those days, she drew detailed sketches of the strange creature and sent them to a well-known ichthyologist named J.L.B. Smith. When Smith finally saw the drawings, he was absolutely stunned. He recognized the heavy, lobed fins and the distinct tail immediately. It was a coelacanth, a creature the entire scientific community believed had disappeared millions of years earlier. He would later describe this incredible event as the most important zoological discovery of the 20th century. The revelation made global headlines, shocking the public and scientists alike. But the mystery was not entirely solved. It would take another 14 years of relentless searching by scientists before a second living coelacanth was finally located near the Comoros Islands in 1952. Interestingly, while the scientific community was completely blindsided, local fishermen in the region had known about the fish for generations, catching it occasionally and referring to it simply as the combessa, the Okapi. Deep within the dense, impenetrable rainforests of the Congo, local communities had lived for centuries with the knowledge of a deeply shy, elusive animal. According to their accounts, this creature possessed the sloping body and neck of a giraffe, but its legs were vividly striped like those of a zebra. When European explorers began traveling through these regions during the late 1800s, they frequently heard these stories from the locals. However, carrying the typical arrogance of the era, the explorers completely dismissed these accounts as mere myths, folklore, or heavily exaggerated tales of animals they already knew. The rumors were so wild that European newspapers even began mocking the mysterious creature, giving it the whimsical nickname of the African unicorn. This collective skepticism remained unchallenged until the year 1900. A British explorer named Sir Harry Johnston decided to take a different approach. Instead of waving away the local accounts as mere fantasy, he chose to investigate the stories seriously. Working closely with local hunters, Johnston eventually obtained pieces of the animal's striped skin, and later, he managed to secure a complete skull. He carefully shipped these remains back to scientists in London. When the researchers examined the physical evidence, they were completely shocked. They quickly realized that these remains did not belong to a zebra, nor any known species of antelope, but to a completely unknown, highly distinct large mammal. In 1901, the species was officially described by the scientific establishment and named Okapi johnstoni in honor of Johnston's open-minded investigation. The discovery was completely extraordinary. Despite its zebra-like stripes, the Okapi turned out not to be related to zebras at all. Later studies involving deep anatomical analysis and modern DNA testing revealed that the Okapi is actually the giraffe's closest living relative, despite looking entirely completely different at first glance. The revelation of the Okapi proved to the world that one of Africa's largest and most magnificent mammals had successfully remained entirely unknown to Western science well into the dawn of the 20th century. The giant squid. For centuries, sailors returning from long, treacherous ocean voyages brought back terrifying stories of enormous tentacled monsters lurking in the deep. They described massive beasts capable of wrapping their arms around the masts of ships and dragging entire crews underwater into the freezing abyss. These nautical stories directly inspired the legendary myth of the Kraken. However, for a very long time, scientists remained heavily skeptical of these claims. There was simply no living specimen to study, and science required physical proof, not just the frightened testimonies of exhausted sailors, but the evidence slowly began to mount. Beginning in the 1800s, enormous, bizarre-looking squid began occasionally washing ashore on remote beaches. Furthermore, whaling crews slicing open the stomachs of harvested sperm whales began finding massive, undigested beaks and giant tentacles inside. These grotesque remains definitively proved that giant squids were real, physical animals sharing our world. But there was a catch. Even with the physical pieces in hand, absolutely nobody had ever observed a giant squid alive in its natural deep ocean habitat. They remained a ghost, completely hidden in the darkness of the sea. The ultimate breakthrough finally occurred in 2004. A dedicated team of Japanese researchers, led by scientist Tsunemi Kubodera, embarked on a mission to find the creature. After hundreds of failed deep-sea expeditions and countless hours of empty ocean drops, their equipment finally captured the very first photographs of a live giant squid actively hunting in the deep ocean. The imagery was revolutionary. Then, 2 years later, in 2006, the same team accomplished the impossible by filming a giant squid alive for the very first time in history. After centuries of intense mystery, wild speculation, and mythological dread, the animal that had directly inspired the world's most famous sea monster legends was finally observed alive, bridging the gap between ancient maritime folklore and modern marine biology. The platypus. When European explorers and settlers first arrived on the distant continent of Australia, they encountered an ecosystem filled with flora and fauna unlike anything found anywhere else on the planet. The isolation of the landmass had allowed evolution to take bizarre and wonderful paths. But even among the bounding kangaroos and sleeping koalas, one of the absolute strangest animals they encountered was the platypus. The sheer visual absurdity of the creature caused an uproar when it was first introduced to the rest of the world. In the year 1799, the very first preserved platypus specimen was packed into a crate and shipped all the way to scientists in Britain. When the researchers opened the box, they simply could not believe what they were looking at. The animal appeared to be an impossible combination of completely unrelated species. It had the broad, flat bill of a duck, the dense, furry body of an otter, the wide paddle-like tail of a beaver, and the webbed feet of a waterfowl. The scientific community was highly skeptical. In fact, many researchers firmly believed they were the victims of an elaborate prank. They assumed that a clever taxidermist in Asia or Australia had taken the parts of several different animals and meticulously sewn them together as a joke to fool the British establishment. Some highly respected scientists literally took scissors and magnifying glasses to the pelt, desperately searching for the hidden stitches that would prove it was a fake. But the surprise was on them. Eventually, as additional, undeniably real specimens continued to arrive in Europe, the scientific community was forced to admit that the creature was entirely genuine. But the platypus was not done shocking the world. As biologists studied the animal alive over the following decades, they discovered even more bizarre facts that defied traditional mammalian rules. They learned that the platypus actually lays eggs instead of giving birth to live young. They discovered that the males produce a potent venom, which they can deliver through sharp spurs on their hind legs, and later, they found out that the platypus hunts underwater by keeping its eyes, ears, and nose completely shut, relying entirely on its bill to detect the faint electrical signals produced by the muscle movements of its prey. The platypus cemented its legacy as one of the most unusual, rule-breaking mammals ever discovered by human beings. The gorilla. For centuries, the indigenous people living in the dense, towering forests of Central Africa knew exactly what gorillas were. They shared the same environment and had a long-standing understanding that these creatures existed in the wild. When European travelers and traders began pushing into the African interior, they frequently heard local stories about giant, incredibly strong, human-like apes that lived deep within the shadowed canopies. However, just as they had done with the Okapi, many European scientists and explorers firmly believed these stories were nothing more than heavily exaggerated myths or superstitious misunderstandings of common chimpanzees or baboons. The existence of an ape that massive seemed totally impossible to the Western world. This widespread disbelief continued until the year 1847. An American missionary and naturalist named Thomas Savage was working in West Africa when he finally obtained undeniable physical proof. He managed to secure several large skulls and skeletal remains of the legendary creatures. Savage teamed up with a skilled anatomist named Jeffries Wyman, and together they meticulously studied the bones. That same year, they officially and scientifically described the gorilla for the very first time in Western history. The public reaction to this discovery was absolutely explosive. Victorian society became instantly fascinated and terrified by the existence of this massive primate. Without understanding the true nature of the animal, many popular newspapers and sensationalist writers began portraying gorillas as aggressive, bloodthirsty, terrifying monsters, completely capable of hunting and attacking humans without provocation. This dark, monstrous reputation fueled wild cultural imaginations for decades. However, the truth was far different. Later, when dedicated biological expeditions and brave researchers finally went into the forest to study living gorillas in their natural habitat, they revealed a completely different reality. The scientists showed the world that gorillas were actually generally peaceful, highly intelligent, and largely gentle vegetarians, whose complex social structures and emotional depth were completely different from their frightening, monstrous early reputation. The Saola, the dense, mist-covered forests stretching along the rugged border between Vietnam and Laos, form the Annamite Range, an area that has long stood as one of the least explored and most rugged ecosystems in all of Asia. Within this isolated wilderness, local villagers had occasionally hunted a highly mysterious, beautifully horned animal that was entirely completely unknown to modern science. For decades, it remained a phantom of the jungle, known only to those who lived directly beside it. But in 1992, the world outside that forest finally caught a glimpse of it. A joint expedition featuring researchers from the Vietnamese Ministry of Forestry and various international conservation organizations traveled to these remote local villages to conduct a biodiversity survey. While resting inside a local hunter's small home, the visiting researchers suddenly noticed a pair of unusually long, straight, gracefully tapering horns hanging prominently on a wall. The scientists were utterly perplexed. No trained biologist or zoologist in the group could recognize the horns or match them to any known species on the planet. This startling observation quickly led to intense, focused biological surveys deep in the nearby forests. After painstakingly gathering more evidence, scientists finally confirmed the existence of a completely new, undocumented large mammal. The discovery was wildly historic. The newly named Saola was the very first large mammal to be discovered anywhere in the world in over 50 years. Its sudden appearance out of nowhere earned it the majestic nickname the Asian unicorn. Yet, despite being officially known to science today, the Saola remains an absolute ghost. Its population is incredibly small, and its habitat is so remote and dense that even today, very few people, including dedicated field researchers, have ever actually seen one alive in the wild. The Komodo Dragon, spread across several small sun-baked islands in the Indonesian archipelago, local residents had long told thrilling stories about the existence of enormous predatory land lizards. They spoke of massive reptiles that stalked the brush, creatures they respectfully referred to as land crocodiles or island dragons. When Dutch colonial officials arrived and established control over the region, they routinely heard these reports. But, as was common during this era, the officials initially dismissed the terrifying reports entirely. They assumed the locals were simply misidentifying common monitor lizards, or perhaps letting their imaginations run wild with exaggerated local folklore. There was no way a lizard of that monstrous size actually existed, but the reports did not stop. By the year 1910, a Dutch military officer named Lieutenant Stein van Hensbroek decided that the sheer volume of repeated reports from the local people warranted a serious investigation. He ventured to the islands to seek out the truth behind the stories. After tracking the creature, he successfully collected precise measurements and eventually obtained actual physical specimens for scientists to examine. In 1912, the naturalist Peter Owen studied the evidence and officially described the species to the world. The discovery sent absolute shockwaves throughout Europe. The idea that a giant, venomous, heavily armored predatory lizard, measuring over 3 meters or 10 feet long, was actively roaming modern islands seemed almost impossible. It looked completely prehistoric, like a dinosaur that had somehow survived the extinction of its relatives. The Komodo dragon quickly became one of the world's most famous and awe-inspiring reptiles. Its terrifying size and dragon-like appearance captured the global imagination, directly inspiring countless adventure books, nature documentaries, and blockbuster monster films for generations to come. The Megamouth Shark. The ocean is vast, but its deepest, darkest layers remain one of the most mysterious frontiers on our planet. Unlike most common sharks that patrol the sunlit coastal waters or open ocean surfaces, the Megamouth Shark lives in the freezing, pitch-black deep ocean waters, swimming far below the depths where humans usually fish or travel. Because its habitat is so extreme and isolated, human encounters with this creature were practically impossible for centuries. It swam silently in the dark, entirely unknown to humanity. That all changed through a stroke of pure, unbelievable accident. On November 15, 1976, a United States Navy research vessel designated AFB-14 was operating in the deep waters near the coast of Hawaii. During their routine operations, the ship had deployed a massive sea anchor deep into the water. When it was time to move, the crew began hauling the heavy anchor back up to the surface. As the equipment broke the waterline, they discovered that the lines had become tangled with an enormous, incredibly bizarre-looking shark. When the stunned crew pulled the heavy, lifeless animal aboard the deck, they immediately knew they had stumbled upon something extraordinary. The creature had a bulbous head, soft, flabby skin, and a massive, cavernous mouth lined with tiny teeth, a feature completely unlike the terrifying jaws of great whites or tiger sharks. When marine biologists were called in to examine the bizarre specimen, they realized they were looking at a shark unlike any that had ever been described in recorded history. The discovery was absolutely amazing to the scientific community. It was not just a new species. The Megamouth became the first known member of an entirely new biological shark family. Since that fateful day in 1976, only a very small number of Megamouth sharks have ever been officially recorded or spotted worldwide. Its ghostly existence deep in the ocean makes it one of the rarest, most elusive large sharks on Earth, and a perfect reminder of how much of our own planet remains completely undiscovered. If you enjoyed this breakdown, please like the video and subscribe to the channel for more, and let me know in the comments if you'd like to see part 2.